Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have Tom Wolfe, author of The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and The Right Stuff, versus John Updike, John Irving, and Norman Mailer. This is a fun one. We've got a heaping dose of pettiness, revenge, clapbacks, and three of the OG literary bros piling on to a man in a pressed white suit. But what I like most about this feud is the bigger issue it reflects concerning a surprisingly prevalent conservative attitude towards literature that remains with us to this day, namely associating the evolution of literary style, an evolution that typically reflects and generates the culture from which it emerges, with some sort of social or cultural decay. To put it more simply, this conservative attitude towards literature suggests that change is bad, tradition is good. Beginning with Tom Wolfe, he's a pretty eccentric figure in literary history. He was a very savvy self-promoter and self-brander. For instance, he's probably most known for his iconic white suit. But his career began as a journalist, but not just any journalist. Along with writers like Truman Capote, Hunter S. Thompson, and Joan Didion, Wolfe, somewhat ironically as you'll see later, helped pioneer what's called new journalism, which distinguished itself from traditional journalism as the journalist would frequently embed themselves amongst the subjects of their writing and tell their own subjective story using very literary techniques like stream of consciousness, for instance. Wolfe's nonfiction novels, as he liked to call them, were quite popular, as he was detailing the countercultural revolution of the 60s and 70s America, writing on things like the hippies, the Black Power movement, and the space race. However, Wolfe had ambitions to write a fictional novel of his own, a project that, in his mind, would become a great American novel because he was going to do what supposedly no other writer dared to do, which is write a realist novel about New York City, which came to be called The Bonfire of the Vanities, published in 1987. 2 years later, in 1989, Wolfe wrote a sort of literary manifesto for Harper's Magazine in which he opens with some rather smug self-praise. Quote, "May I be forgiven if I take as my text the 6th page of the 4th chapter of The Bonfire of the Vanities?" After dropping a passage from his novel, he goes on to detail why he wrote a realist novel about New York City, which includes him diagnosing everything wrong with American literature in the latter half of the 20th century. Discussing the literature that was coming out during the countercultural revolution of the 60s and 70s, he writes, quote, "Half the publishers along Madison Avenue had their noses pressed against their thermopane glass walls, scanning the billion-footed city for the approach of the young novelist who surely would bring them the big novels of the racial classes, the hippie movements, the New Left, the Wall Street boom, the sexual revolution, the war in Vietnam. But such creatures, it seemed, no longer existed." If you are a student of literature, you might be thinking to yourself, this sounds like a bad faith argument that is also wildly untrue, and it is. There were plenty of novels written at this time dedicated to these topics. I mean, Thomas Pynchon was out there. But Wolfe's issue isn't necessarily that novels about these topics weren't being written, it's about how they were being written. To put it somewhat simply, Wolfe grieves what he believes to be American writers, their lost art of literary realism, which he aligns with writers like Steinbeck and Hemingway. He argues that post-World War II, however, the realist novel became aligned with sort of a narrow bourgeois taste and thus rejected by the American intelligentsia in favor of anti-realism. What Wolfe is describing as anti-realism is really just postmodernism, although he never uses that term. He criticizes literature's new obsession with irony, fabulism, magical realism, and just sort of overall avant-garde experimentation, which also means that he explicitly criticizes the work of writers like Samuel Beckett, John Barth, and he goes pretty hard on Borges too. These writers, whom he believes represent a broader tendency in writing at that time, he says they forfeit writing about a real and rapidly changing world in favor of their own kind of self-amusement. Quote, "Many of these writers were brilliant. They were virtuosos. They could do things within the narrow limits they had set for themselves that were more clever and amusing than anyone could have ever imagined. But what was this lonely island they had moved to? The imagination of the novelist is powerless before what he knows he's going to read in tomorrow morning's newspaper. But a generation of American writers has drawn precisely the wrong conclusion from that perfectly valid observation. The answer is not to leave the rude beast, the material, also known as the life around us, to the journalist, but to do what journalists do, or are supposed to do, which is to wrestle the beast and bring it to terms. And finally, while comparing himself to the likes of William Thackeray and Charles Dickens, Tom Wolfe discusses how he went about writing a great realist novel and encourages other writers to return to realism for the sake of both literature's survival and its continued cultural imprint. Now, it probably won't surprise you to hear that writers, especially some of those who are explicitly mentioned in Wolfe's manifesto, were none too pleased. After all, here was someone from the world of journalism who had only recently made his way into fiction proper, telling them how to write the great American novel and chastising them for their taste in trends, essentially calling them sheeple if they tended towards anti-realism. And indeed, you can read the essay for yourself, but it reeks of condescension. In other words, Wolfe had wittingly or unwittingly placed a rather large target on his back, and his fellow writers waited patiently for their chance to strike. For 10 years, Wolfe would work on his second work of fiction, A Man in Full. You might think 10 years was enough time for his fellow writers to forgive or forget his manifesto, but writers are a very petty breed unto themselves. So upon the novel's publication, there was an absolute groundswell of negative reviews that came from prominent writers, most notably some old friends of ours, John Updike, John Irving, and Norman Mailer. In his review titled A Man Half Full, Norman Mailer opens with a deliberate callback to Wolfe's manifesto 10 years prior, as he begins his review of Wolfe by first including a few paragraphs from Mailer's own book, which I think is pretty funny. Afterwards, Mailer goes on to say, "The book has gas and runs out of gas, fills up again, goes dry. It is a 742-page work that reads as if it is 1,500 pages long. Electric at best, banal at worst, banal like a long afternoon spent watching soap operas." In a review simply titled, "All Right," John Updike says, quote, "A Man in Full still amounts to entertainment, not literature, even literature in a modest, aspirant form. Like a movie desperate to recoup its banker's investment, the novel tries too hard to please us." In an interview, John Irving was asked about this war that was brewing between those writers, and he said, quote, "I don't think it's a war, because you can't have a war between a pawn and a king, can you?" And in case that wasn't enough, Irving also hit Wolfe where it would likely hurt the most, insulting Wolfe's work not just as a work of fiction, but also insulting Wolfe's background as a journalist, stating that the novel is, quote, like reading a bad newspaper or a bad piece in a magazine. It makes you wince. Tom Wolfe would respond to John Irving shortly thereafter, noting, quote, "Irving is a great admirer of Dickens, but what writer does he see now the last year constantly compared to Dickens? Not John Irving, but Tom Wolfe. It must gnaw at him terribly." Wolfe would go on to brand Mailer and Updike as, quote, "two old piles of bones," and collectively referring to all three writers as his Three Stooges. But it's not over yet, because in 2001, John Irving said, quote, "I don't know a serious writer who reads Tom Wolfe, but I would never have said Wolfe was a bad writer had he not written his absurd position paper on how to write the American novel." And later, in 2009, Irving was asked to reflect on this whole affair. He said, quote, "I don't imagine when he wrote that he was aware of how many writers who'd been writing fiction longer and writing it better than he does might have been offended by that prescriptive piece. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he was just speaking from the heart, and he didn't know it would be irritating." So let me know who you got in this one, Tom Wolfe or his Three Stooges.